By now you've learned about some of the misconceptions that keep us from seeing what we need to see. But as you heard Kimberly say in the last session, we cannot recognize this risk visually. We must recognize this risk behaviorally. We have to understand the patterns of behavior used by abusers to gain access to children, prepare them for inappropriate sexual interaction, and then keep them silent. The key to protecting children in your care is to understand and recognize the grooming process of the offender. In this session, Gregory will guide us through the grooming process, giving us a better understanding of behaviors that should alert us to risks we need to guard against.
So what are the behaviors we need to identify? It's the grooming process of the preferential offender. Understanding the grooming process is the key to recognizing what we need to see. So that's what we're going to discuss now. Let me make an observation, then walk you through the grooming process in 4 steps. First, the observation. From the standpoint of the abuser, grooming has 2 main efforts: grooming the child and grooming the gatekeepers. Now, who are the gatekeepers? Parents, coaches, teachers, babysitters, youth workers, big brother, anybody through whom the abuser has to go to gain access to a child. Now, it's important to note that the grooming of a child can look different depending on the age, gender, and circumstance of the child, or the type of program. But the grooming of the gatekeeper generally looks the same. The abuser wants to convince the gatekeeper that he or she is helpful, trustworthy, and kind. Why helpful, trustworthy, and kind? You see, the abuser wants trusted time alone with the child. They understand how we live and how we do community. But how do we live and do community? You see, when someone's a stranger on the outside, no access to children, barriers stay up. But you see, when someone is on the inside of the community, barriers of protection come down. You see, we often equate helpful, trustworthy, and kind with safe. That's why the abuser wants on the inside. And you see, to get on the inside, they will try to convince the gatekeepers, you and me, that they are helpful, trustworthy, and kind. Now, when we talk about the grooming process, we're going to break it down into 4 steps. Now, as I mentioned, the grooming of a child can look different depending on the age, gender, and circumstance of the child, or the type of program. The first step of the grooming process is gaining access. What the preferential offender wants to do is gain access to an environment or program where there are children within the offender's age and gender of preference. Normally, that offender will seek a career or volunteer opportunity in a program where that age and gender of children are present. A career or volunteer opportunity. You see, another way to say that is the abuser needs a name tag. That is what gives a person access to the children within the program. Once the preferential abuser has gained access, they will work hard to gain the trust of the gatekeepers with the purpose of disarming people responsible for protecting the children in that program. This is grooming the gatekeepers. Now, abusers are usually skilled at meeting a child's needs for time, attention, and practical things like new shoes, a winter coat, or a ride to or from practice, which wins the trust of the child and works further to disarm the gatekeepers. The second step of the grooming process involves selecting a child. This step is about the abuser identifying one or more specific children within the program. Offender studies help us understand who is more likely to be the target of an abuser in a particular program. This is commonly a child who is disconnected, on the fringe, or has unmet needs in some way. It's the child who's on the edge of the herd, so to speak. Identifying this child is not difficult. Just watch them gather or play. You'll often recognize that child that just doesn't connect or doesn't fit in. Now, why is this disconnected child high risk? The abuser intends to isolate a child for inappropriate sexual interaction. And you see, the child who's disconnected or on the edge of the herd is easier to carve away from the group into isolation, where the abuser intends to introduce nudity and sexual touch. An abuser is skilled at approaching a program, selecting the child, winning that child's trust, and then isolating the child. He or she wants to weave in rule breaking and introduce inappropriate touch and talk, with the end game being inappropriate sexual behavior. Another high-risk child is the one who's looking for someone to follow or trust, or a young person who is looking for attention, affection, or affirmation. Sometimes it's a child from a broken family or a single-parent home, where caretakers are often maxed out with responsibilities. Abusers know this and seek to take advantage of this. It can also be a child who is already interested in alcohol or drugs, where an abuser can use that to pull them into forbidden behaviors. This weaves in secrecy into the relationship while also lowering inhibitions through impairment. A child who's already interested in pornography or sex presents another target for the abuser. Studies tell us that the average age of first exposure to pornography today for a boy is 8 years of age. Although pornography pulls in more girls than it ever did before, it's still a male-dominated struggle. So the abuser targeting a middle school or teen male will often use pornography as a part of the grooming process. Now, in each of these instances, the abuser is looking for a way to introduce rule breaking into the child's world, especially if the rule breaking can involve impairment, alcohol or drugs, or nudity, pornography, or the exchange of racy images. Finding an activity that is off limits or against the rules at home is valuable to the abuser because it opens the door to weave in rule breaking and secrecy. Maybe it's a mature-rated video game. Maybe it's content the child can watch on Netflix at the abuser's house but not at home. Maybe it's smoking cigarettes. Now, although cigarettes don't impair in the same way as drugs or alcohol, cigarettes are effective in introducing rule breaking, which has value to an abuser. From there, it's not hard for the abuser to take steps to add more rules to break, which eventually involve inappropriate sexual touch and talk. This brings us to step 3 of the grooming process, which is the introduction of nudity and sexual touch. Keep in mind, first the abuser gains access, then selects a specific child. Now the abuser intends to shape the interaction to involve nudity and sexual touch. This step incorporates a concept that may be new to many of you, and that is the concept of barrier testing and erosion. Now, what are the barriers we're talking about? Barrier testing begins with an understanding that we all have a sense of what is appropriate or acceptable. The abuser wants to know, where is the child's sense of appropriate touch and talk? Where are the boundaries? The abuser will test the child's barriers of what is appropriate touch or conversation or language or body comments and attempt to erode those barriers, push them back, giving way to inappropriate sexual talk or touch. So when it comes to barrier testing and erosion, an abuser is interested in what is acceptable touch, acceptable talk. We'll learn where the barriers are and whether those barriers are negotiable. Barrier testing and erosion may look different depending on the age and gender of the child, but the goal is the same: learning where the objections are and if they're negotiable. Can the abuser push through barriers, with the end game being inappropriate sexual touch or talk? The goal of the abuser is to introduce nudity and sexual touch. This part of the grooming process will commonly include sexual discussions and joking, or introducing sexual comments or banter in ongoing interaction, sending or requesting images that get increasingly more graphic or sexual in nature. Kids are intrigued by the idea of sexual interaction, sexual joking, or sexual discussion. The abuser simply takes advantage of that. This part of the grooming process will likely involve playful touch or accidental nudity. Accidental, of course, only for the children who are watching it. Abusers use seemingly accidental nudity and playful touch in order to continue to push against those barriers with the children they are grooming. Playful touch used by the abuser can include tickling, wrestling, roughhousing, pantsing, massages, and so on. These kinds of behaviors can seem acceptable if done in a playful or a joking way. Common grooming behaviors when the target child is a middle school or teen boy often involve alcohol, drugs, pornography, horseplay, coarse joking, and playful or accidental nudity. Now, the common grooming behaviors when the target child is a middle school or teen girl often involves communication, and interaction that deteriorates into sexual topics. The communication will often include texting, social media, or other electronic communication with direct messaging features. The abuser will push back barriers to include references to body features, and in some cases, request nude photos or videos. The communication will often begin in ways that seem harmless or program-related. The abuser then pushes into the barriers by communication that continues to deteriorate through comments and topics, baiting the girl into participation, with the abuser's end game being inappropriate sexual interaction. When a child is very small, the grooming process will not involve alcohol, pornography, social media, or texting. When the target child is under 8 or 9, the grooming will often involve forms of playful touch and a movement toward isolation, lap sitting, tickling, and other types of touch games, forms of touch during nap times or bathroom visits. What these all have in common is the abuser engaging in barrier testing and erosion, with the end game being inappropriate sexual interaction. The last step of the grooming process is keeping the victim silent. It is very important to the abuser to keep the child quiet. It is also important to note that this is the only step in the process that is not sequential. You see, the abuser is weaving secrecy into the entire process along the way. And abusers are very good at keeping victims silent. There are a variety of ways the abuser can keep a child quiet, whether it's with threats, guilt, or shame. Many children who have been sexually abused have a sense of responsibility for the sexual activity that occurred. We've spoken to thousands of abuse survivors who echo the same sort of sentiment, that feeling that somehow they are responsible and feel as though it was my fault. There was something about me that made my abuser choose me. There's something inherently flawed in me that caused me to be victimized. This is, of course, not true at all, but it is a common feeling that is shared by children who have been sexually abused, and their abusers capitalize on this sense of shame and embarrassment about the sexual activity in order to keep the child silent. They will use threats, ranging from very direct to incredibly subtle. The most significant threat, one that's very subtle and very effective, is also the number one reason why children don't tell. No one will believe me. It hurts to think about this one because unfortunately, and all too commonly, it's true. Children are often not believed when they tell. And some of it goes back to what we discussed at the beginning of this session: abusers groom the gatekeepers. The people who are on the periphery of the circumstance or program tend to believe that the abuser is helpful, trustworthy, and kind, a person who would never sexually abuse a child. But here's the truth. The CDC tells us that 98% of all outcries made by children are factual, even if the child recants. So what's the takeaway here? Be prepared to believe the child. Kimberly and I are confident that understanding the grooming process is the key to preventing child sexual abuse and helping us to better respond to those who have been victimized.